Welcome in to the ESPN 2020 Virtual Fantasy Summit. Field Yates, along with my talented friends, Matthew Berry, Eric Karabell, and Mike Clay. And today we are talking wide receivers. But before we do that, gentlemen, how are you? Starting with Matthew.
I'm good, my friend. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Mike Clay, how about you? Thanks for joining us this morning.
Happy to be here. Let's do this.
And Eric, thank you to having you as well. And I don't know why I say this morning, because let's be honest, people could be watching this at any time of the day. But for those of you that are watching in the morning, good morning. Hello, Eric.
Someday when I get older, I want to grow a beard like Mike Clay's. That looks good.
Yeah, Mike Clay's is coming in strong right now. Matthew and Eric and I have opted for the more clean-cut look because we're real professionals. Just like our friend Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas has or had the most incredible wide receiver season we've seen in quite some time, one of the finest ever. He was the consensus number one wide receiver for us as we started to build our ranks going into 2020. And I'm going to start right now with Eric Karabell again. How many other players amongst wide receivers are legitimately in the top five discussion? Because, man, does it feel like a deep group this year.
And it always feels like a deep group field. I mean, you can always make a case for a lot of wide receivers in the top five and in the top 10, whereas at the other positions, there's always something going on at quarterback. There's never enough running backs, never enough tight ends. But wide receiver is the stable position every year in drafts right now. I would say Michael Thomas has to be the number one choice. And then you could go with, I think, like 6 or 7 other options in the top 5. Deandre Hopkins, Devante Adams, either of the Tampa Bay guys, and Tyreek Hill. You really can't go wrong here in the middle to the end of the first round with any of these top wide receivers. And you could even go wide receiver in the second round as well because of the running back choices. Either way, lots of good wide receivers every year.
So, Mike, any other wide receivers that maybe you didn't hear from Eric that might strike you as, I don't know about top 5 upside, but like players that should be in the mix for a top 5 wide receiver pick? Because when I think wide receiver upside, I think there could be about 15 or 20 guys that I could envision having a top 5 season this year.
Yeah, no doubt, including a couple busts we're going to talk about later from last year, like a Jeju Smith-Schuster or, an Odell Beckham perhaps can jump back into that conversation. But I think that group is laid out pretty well. I think maybe you make a case for a Chris Godwin or Mike Evans, but there's a kind of an offensive change there, obviously a quarterback change in Tampa Bay. So I think it really comes down to that top 5 group. I mean, look, Devante Adams has missed time with injuries, but he was number 2 during his 12 active weeks last season. DeAndre Hopkins has been top 5 for the past 5 seasons. Julio Jones, top 7 each of the past 6 seasons. Tyreek Hill, top 4 in fantasy points per game each of his 4 seasons. Those 5 guys, including Thomas, have an excellent case for the top 5. I think that's your group.
Matthew, any other name that you want to throw into that mix? Because, again, there is so much depth at wide receiver that I could, again, envision so many guys wind up becoming top 5 wideouts this season.
No, I mean, look, I agree with Mike there that there's some big name guys that disappointed last year, like Beckham, like Jeju, that certainly wouldn't shock you if they wind up top 5. There's some other guys. Listen, Kenny Galilei was a top 5 fantasy wide receiver before Matthew Stafford got injured. So is somebody like that. Allen Robinson, everyone goes like, Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson was the 8th best wide receiver in fantasy last year. I mean, so, DJ Moore got tremendous volume. Does he take another leap, right, with a more accurate quarterback and a terrible defense once again behind him where they're going to have to throw in Carolina? My guess is none of those guys get into the top 5. I don't have any of those guys ranked inside my top 5. But would it shock me if those guys wound up there? No. And to the point about the depth of the position, last year, 19 different wide receivers averaged 15 or more fantasy points per game. 34 wide receivers averaged 12.5 points per game. Think about 2018, there were 20 wide receivers that averaged 15 or more points. So again, to Eric's point, it's a very deep position where I always want to get one stud, but then I like to try to wait because there's always guys. You can always find production later at the wide receiver position.
So going right back to you, Matthew, you sort of explained it, I think, to a degree, but because there's so much depth, how does that impact your draft strategy? Like if you have a top, let's say 7 pick, are you saying to yourself, I get it. You could make the case for Michael Thomas as one of the top 10 or top 7 players in fantasy football, but if you believe in value-based drafting, you might be better to just take a running back because of the scarcity there.
there's certainly more scarcity in running back. Look, you're not going to lose your league because you draft Michael Thomas in the first round. There's a lot of, he's terrific, and certainly players come into the league and produce produce more than their ADP at every position. Having said that, yes, when I haven't revealed my top 200 yet, but when it does, the first round will be, mostly running backs. But Michael Thomas will be there, certainly within my top 5.
Totally, but just sort of maybe speaking more holistically, Mike, going over to you, do you think you need to sort of think in your mind that sort of like in the real NFL draft, why did teams, or I shouldn't say why, but some teams felt as though they could bypass a wide receiver in round 1 because a player at pick 50 might be there? Fantasy football is a little bit different, but do you think the depth of this class is going to impact how you are evaluating every other position in fantasy football?
I think so to some extent. I think it definitely has an effect. But look, on one hand, I think running backs as a whole are a little bit overvalued this year because they're coming off a great year in terms of injury rate, right? Like I just players don't stay that healthy at the running back position. It was a good year. So those guys that held up are being kind of overvalued in drafts, and the position is as a whole. So you have to consider that. But on the other hand, if you still go running back heavy early and grab 2 star running backs, you still have great middle tier options, middle round options at the wide receiver position. And I was looking at my rankings. Some guys outside my top 30 right now have tremendous upside. Think about Tyler Boyd, DK Metcalf, Marvin Jones, Michael Gallup, Will Fuller, and Brandon Cooks in that new look Houston wide receiver group. Jamison Crowder has a tremendously high floor. All of the rookies, all of those guys are outside my top 30 right now. So to Matthew's point, if you go, say, running back, and get a star receiver in your first 3 picks, you're going to still have a ton of options at wide receiver later on.
Yeah, there certainly are plenty of options at wide receiver. Heck, you could have plenty of options at wide receiver just with the Buccaneers alone, Eric Karabell. And, for a while we said, hey, Tom Brady goes to Tampa Bay, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, both maybe top 7 or top 8 wide receivers. We haven't heard as much about them so far, and part of that might be the fact that it's not just Tom Brady that came, but also Rob Gronkowski. So how maybe did the additions of Brady and Gronk impact those 2 wide receivers, Eric? And is there one that you prefer more than the other?
I think I want Chris Godwin over Evans. I have him a couple spots higher, not a lot. I have them both in my top 10. And the reason would be that we know that Tom Brady can throw great intermediate passes to Julian Edelman, and I think Godwin's going to take that role where Godwin could even get like 100 receptions this season, whereas Evans I don't think is going to be targeted quite as much because he's more of a downfield player. Tampa Bay's offense I think is going to be electric this season. I would take Godwin here. And one point to earlier, roster construction can be done in a lot of ways. If your top 2 wide receivers are T.Y. Hilton and John Brown, you can still win a league, assuming that you built the rest of the roster well, running backs and tight ends. So I never go into a draft saying, I have to take a wide receiver in round 1, or I have to have 2 in the top 4 rounds. That's just not a good way to build a roster because you want to see what the draft gives you. You're not going to lose your league in round 1 taking a receiver, but you can lose your league going into a draft saying, I've got to take this position in this round. That's how you mess up a draft.
Yeah, well, that probably applies to the real draft as well, EK. And I'm still thinking about the Buccaneers in the red zone where they've got Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Rob Gronkowski, who I believe are all at least 6'3", and maybe amongst the best red zone weapons if Gronk is old Gronk again that we've seen in quite some time. So we've been talking about the depth of this year's class.
And by the way, Field?
Yes.
O.J. Howard's not a shrimp either.
Yeah. If they throw it to him, I'm with you on that. You're absolutely right.
It's right. If you just go 4 wide at the when they're getting close with those 4 guys, somebody's going to win the ball.
Who's the tallest free agent wide receiver available? Because they should sign him.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know.
That's a good question. We'll figure that in another time. But still, the Bucs should be a menace to handle in the red zone this upcoming season. So moving along here, we have a couple of players in Kenny Galilei and DJ Moore that are kind of tucked inside our top 10, close to consensus. But beyond that, things get really tricky. So it's almost like wide receiver 11 is where the more fascinating part of the conversation gets going. So let's move forward here to some of the bounce back candidates that might be in that next tier. And I'll go to Mike Clay here on Juju Smith-Schuster, because Juju has all the talent. And Juju is still a really young player. He entered the league at age 20. But he's a veteran coming off of a disappointing season, an injury-riddled season, and having to catch passes from quarterbacks that weren't Ben Roethlisberger. Is he a safe bounce-back player, given that there seems to be a lot of optimism surrounding Ben's return from that major elbow injury?
Well, safe and fantasy football, I don't think really go together. So I would not say that field. I would say that he's intriguing, absolutely intriguing. Look, this guy had 111 catches, over 1,400 yards, 7 touchdowns in his age 21 season. This guy has a ton of talent, ton of ability. Still, maybe not even prime years yet. And I don't want to hear that he only did that because Antonio Brown was there. That's nonsense. You don't put up numbers like that because you have a good number 1 wide receiver. It could boost a little bit, but the guy has a ton of talent, ton of ability. It's a pass-heavy offense. Remember, when we last saw Ben Roethlisberger for a full season, he led the NFL in passing, and the Steelers set an offensive record for touchdowns. So there is a lot to like here. I think he's a top 15 fantasy wide receiver. But again, I wouldn't call him safe. There's definitely some risk after what we saw last season.
You know, Matthew, sometimes we talk about how when a number 2 wide receiver is not playing with his number 1 wideout, it doesn't actually help his value. It might hurt his value a little bit. So Tyler Boyd was an example of this last year, where it's not like A.J. Green's absence meant like a ton of more work for Tyler Boyd. You know, Juju's a really talented guy. He played his first season alongside Antonio Brown. Is it possible that maybe we want the ceiling to be higher for Juju, but it won't be as high because he no longer has a clear-cut, bona fide superstar wide receiver alongside him?
I think it's hard to say that. I think we just don't know. The Steelers' offense was just so brutal last year that it's impossible to say, hey, based on last year, they were so awful, changing quarterbacks. Like, it's just such a different offense without Ben Roethlisberger. I mean, so they just, we did our rookie show, our podcast, me, you, and Mike the other day, and we briefly touched on Chase Claypool. But I don't know if you saw the reports that came out that the Steelers said basically the expectation here, and this was surprising, but the expectation is they want Chase Claypool to play on the outside this year. And again, we'll see what ends up happening, but the expectation is that this means Juju Smith-Schuster moves more inside, which he had a lot of success at. So I would think that the Steelers' number 1 goal on offense after getting Ben Roethlisberger healthy and back is to make sure Juju has a big year here, because they have some other nice pieces. They have, in Washington, Deontay Johnson, and we'll see what they get out of Claypool. They signed Eric Ebron, the veteran tight end. But it's going to be the Juju show. Mike mentioned, like, this is a pass-heavy offense with Ben, and when they pass, they're throwing to Juju Smith-Schuster. So I don't know that I don't think we have enough data to say, like, oh, he definitely misses Antonio Brown. Certainly he had a lot of success with Antonio Brown there, but again, let's see what happens. And that's, by the way, that's baked into his ADP, right? Because of last year. If this were a year ago and he's coming up the season he had with the last Antonio Brown season, he goes top 6. That's where he was drafted last year. But because of the disappointment of the entire Steelers offense and Juju himself last year, he's now going, 15 or later.
Eric, the mastermind behind the summit, when it's held in person and when it's done virtually like this year, is Keith Lipscomb. He is a diehard Browns fan. So I'm going to ask you about Odell Beckham Jr. But before you answer, can you advise as to whether Keith needs to put earmuffs on about whether Odell can be a bounce-back candidate this year? He's healthy. He has a new head coach, but the same quarterback in Baker Mayfield. You optimistic on OBJ?
It's looking good, Keith. This is the year for the Browns. I think this is the year they win the division. I do think that things are looking up for the Browns. The problem with Odell is, well, how should I say this delicately? Like, there's a lot going on with him, okay? Wide receiver stuff, diva stuff there. And I do think his quarterback is going to be in a better position this year. You have to think that Baker Mayfield is going to be a little bit more mature coming into 2020 or the next full season. So I do think that Cleveland's offense, if they can protect Baker Mayfield, the run game is strong, the tight end situation has drastically improved since last year. I don't know if we can expect Odell Beckham Jr. to have years like he did with the Giants. That's the mistake a lot of people make. Oh, Juju's going to do what he did 2 years ago. Odell's going to do what he did 2 years ago. T.Y. Hilton. Stop comparing guys to what they did in the past. We know they're skilled, but their situations have changed. So I do think that Odell's going to have a good season, but can I tell you definitively that it's going to be better than Jarvis Landry? It wasn't last year. I'm not so sure it will be again.
It's kind of interesting how Jarvis Landry seems to become underappreciated, despite the fact that through the first 4 seasons of his career, he had more catches than any player in NFL history at the time. Of course, Michael Thomas took care of waxing that record, but still, Jarvis has been very, very productive. Mike, I know you've been big on this. Can you interrupt
here for 1 second here, Phil? I just want to say.
Absolutely not, Matthew. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
I think this is an interesting conversation here because I think this also goes a little bit to draft strategy. Like, for me, I understand Eric's point, and I get that. But for me, I would much rather, where they're currently going, I would much rather take a flyer on Odell Beckham Jr. than Jarvis Landry. Jarvis Landry is what he is, which is a very solid wide receiver who's going to get very solid production. But Odell Beckham Jr. has the talent to be a top 5 guy. Mm-hmm. Like, he could be a league winner. Now, he can also be a league loser, right? I mean, he was brutal last year. But my point is that I would rather bet on that upside. I mean, even in a completely lost year for the entire Browns offense and Beckham specifically, he was top 5 in the NFL among wide receivers in terms of end zone targets. Like, Baker was looking for him. They were trying to get him scores. He was still 8th in target share. And so my expectation here is that Browns offense is a lot better this year. I think Kevin Stefanski and his offense will be a much better fit than what Freddie Kitchens does. It seems like there was a lot of dysfunction last year in Cleveland. What else is new?
But you think so?
Yes. But I actually think the Browns offense is a little bit of a post-hype sleeper, and I would include Baker Mayfield and Odell Beckham Jr. in that mix. But it just goes to this, like, again, there's some mid-tier guys that are like, oh, those guys are going to be solid. They're going to be a solid, 12 points a game. And then there's guys like Jeju or Beckham who, if they get back to where they were 2 years ago, could win you the league.
Agreed on that. So, Mike, let's move along here to the Chargers wide receivers. You've been very good on this because we've known for a while that Phillip Rivers would not be back. We assumed for a while that Tyrod Taylor would be the starting quarterback. I'm not sure we can say that with full confidence after they drafted Justin Herbert, 6th overall, but it's not going to be Phillip Rivers. How much does whoever the starter is downgrade the value of Keenan Allen, most specifically, but also Mike Williams, a guy who, in his own great moments, has looked like a dominant player?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to downgrade both guys at least a little bit, right? So right now, Keenan Allen, I have at wide receiver 12, right? So not quite a wide receiver 1 anymore. Mike Williams is just outside my top 50. But, I mean, think about this with Keenan Allen. He's been targeted 758 times in his career. All but 7 have come from Phillip Rivers. That's been his guy in the NFL. So this is a huge change for him. He's already coming off a season where he was pretty inconsistent, right? He was top 20 in half of his outings. He was outside the top 30 in the rest. He hasn't gone over 6 touchdowns since 2013, so he's not going to help you out a lot there. And now you switch to either a rookie quarterback or a quarterback who's extremely conservative, and Tyrod Taylor scrambles a lot, which takes away pass attempts. That was never an issue with Phillip Rivers, of course, who almost never scrambled. And Tyrod takes a lot of sacks as well. So I'm definitely a little concerned. I think it lowers the ceiling a bit here in 2020. And then Mike Williams is tough because, I mean, he is a lot like a Phillip Rivers. He's very boom bust, right? I mean, he was number 1 in the NFL in average depth of target and yards per catch last season. You're going to see a lot of downfield throws to him, not a low catch rate, but perhaps a bunch of big plays. And he's also a bounce back candidate in the touchdown department. Extremely unlucky in that department. Probably the unluckiest player, if not for Leonard Fournette in the NFL last season. So he should score more, but is the production going to be consistent or the targets going to be inconsistent? I don't think so. For me, Williams more of a bench player, not really a guy you want to start.
Yeah, fascinating year ahead for the Chargers in a lot of ways. We'll see how long, whether it is Tyrod Taylor who begins the year, he actually stays a starter throughout the season. It just feels like Keenan Allen, though, finds a way. I don't know, man. Maybe that's simplifying things way too much.
Can I just say something here about Tyrod Taylor? Mike's exactly right about what he is. But back in 2015, I believe, Sammy Watkins did have a 1,000-yard receiving season with 9 touchdowns with Tyrod as the primary quarterback. So to me, I don't want to move Keenan Allen too far out of my top 20 wide receivers, or just say that Mike Williams can't break out like he did a couple years ago with more catch. Mike Williams could be better than Keenan Allen, frankly, if Tyrod can throw a little bit downfield. So, like, people are viewing the Chargers wide receivers, the Patriots wide receivers as guys they don't want to have anymore. Frankly, I don't see the Patriots wide receiver Edelman or James White really coming back that far. I mean, Stidham is going to throw a lot of, safer passes underneath. So it's a mistake people are making to just say, forget about Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, and Julian Edelman. I'm not forgetting about them. Those are good values if they fall too far in the draft.
Interesting stuff there. Go ahead, Matthew.
I think it just depends on, honestly, for me, it's about the quarterback there, right? I don't disagree that potentially they could be values because both guys are dropping. The concern here, to Mike's point about Tyrod Taylor, is Tyrod Taylor just doesn't throw guys open. He is very conservative, as Mike says, and what he is like he doesn't. There are certain quarterbacks that will throw into coverage that will be like, you know what, I don't care. I think I'm going to trust my wide receiver to win a one-on-one and come down with a jump ball or use his body. Like, if you're covered, like, Tyrod's just not throwing to you. So wide receivers that don't get a lot of separation don't get the ball with Tyrod. That's not Sammy Watkins' issue. Sammy Watkins can get it, but Keenan Allen is sometimes pretty good at that, but it just depends. Like, and we just don't know what Justin Herbert's going to do. So to me, that's the concern there. I think you will see less volume there. But to your point about Mike Williams, like, Tyrod has a little bit of street ball in him sometimes when, to Mike's point, when he'll scramble around and, hey, there's a guy open deep. So you could see some – Mike Williams is a really interesting best ball candidate, I guess is what I would say there, because I do agree with Mike in terms of his sort of boom-bust potential there. Not somebody I would want to count on in his fantasy league this year other than in a best ball situation. But, yeah, if Keenan Allen's your number 2 wide receiver, I got no issue with that. I just think you'd be concerned with him as your number 1.
Let's move forward. We got to keep things moving here. And just a minute ago, Eric invoked Sammy Watkins in Buffalo with Tyrod Taylor as his quarterback. So I'm going to allow you first crack at this question. Eric, how much value or how much did Stephon Diggs' value change, perhaps take a hit, by going from Minnesota to Buffalo? It's a different quarterback. Obviously, Josh Allen, not quite as polished as a passer as Kirk Cousins is, but maybe this offense has a little bit more of grip it and rip it to it than we saw in Minnesota.
Well, certainly I've given him some more options to do that with. I mean, it's hard to predict Stephon Diggs to get 1,000 yards in Buffalo, so I'm going to say he's a borderline candidate to do that. I have him outside my top 20, but John Brown for a while last year was pretty good, and I think that only helps John Brown to have Diggs there with him. Kirk Cousins wasn't the most accurate guy in Minnesota, as we all know, and Diggs still got some numbers. So to me, Diggs is more like a T.Y. Hilton guy, a wide receiver 3. That's where I have Keenan Allen as well. And I do think that Justin Jefferson replacing him in Minnesota is going to have a huge season out of the slot there. He's my top rookie wide receiver for Cousins. That doesn't mean Cousins is accurate or somebody you can rely on in fantasy, but his weapons, I think, can. Josh Allen's weapons, Josh Allen's going to get his rushing yards, but his receivers, I don't think 1,000 yards is what you can count on for Brown or Diggs.
You know something, Eric, on the podcast we did on Monday, which is maybe if you're watching this in a much further date, you may not care about what date it was, but we did a post-draft wrap-up podcast, and I made the point that I think there's a chance Justin Jefferson could have the best rookie role amongst wide receivers. Another reason why I would say you're the smartest person I've ever met that talks about fantasy football, as you just suggested the same thing right there about Justin Jefferson going to Minnesota. Mike, other side of the coin is Adam Thielen, who last year was really banged up because of injury. He's had a couple of just ridiculous seasons in his career. 2 years ago was particularly masterful. Does the departure of Stephon Diggs mean anything for Adam Thielen, or is Adam Thielen's success more just tied to the fact that he's a really good player as long as he stays healthy?
Well, first of all, I don't want Vikings fans upset with us, and specifically Eric talking down on Kirk Cousins, who just had one of the most efficient seasons in the league last year. The guy was awesome last year, and still Stephon Diggs was only wide receiver 24, even with Adam Thielen sidelined for half the season. So that's kind of a concern with Diggs for me. So respect to Cousins. He has his faults, but he had a good season last year. And that's good news for Adam Thielen. He's my wide receiver 10. I think he's going to be a little bit undervalued in drafts this season. I know he missed 6 games last season, but he never missed a game before that. He's 30 years old now. Fine. I still think he is, toward the end of his prime, but still has a few good years left. So I'm not worried about durability. And check this out. A top 10 fantasy receiver in 2017 and 2018. Last year before the injury, he was 9th in fantasy points. The guy has consistently delivered back-end wide receiver 1 numbers. Absolutely love him in drafts this year. And the target share floor is massive, guys, because Diggs is not there, and the number 2 is a rookie.
Yeah,
All right, so
point, Mike, to that point, over the last 3 seasons, when Stephon Diggs has been off the field, Adam Thielen's been targeted on over 25% of his routes. When he sees 9 or more targets in his career, he's averaging 22.8 points per game. I mean, just massive numbers. So would not shock me. I mean, you've got Michael Thomas, but would not shock me if Adam Thielen is top 3 in the NFL in targets this year.
Let's spin things forward and go all the way to the West Coast, where the Los Angeles Rams have a new-look offense in a lot of ways. No Todd Gurley, no Brandon Cooks, but the 2 best pass catchers that are still there are Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. And it was a weird year last year. Woods was incredible. He just couldn't score touchdowns. He ended up with just 2. Meanwhile, Cooper Kupp, all he did, it felt like, was score lots and lots and lots of touchdowns. Matthew, I'm going to hand this one off to you because his name, of course, is Matthew's little Cooper Kupp. What do you expect out of these 2 wide receivers? And is there a third that might carry some fantasy relevance? Because this is one of those rare offenses that has shown recently, specifically in 2018, that it could sustain 3 fantasy relevant wide receivers.
So I'll address that first, and the answer to me is no. If you want to take a late-round flyer on Josh Reynolds or the rookie Van Jefferson, who will compete to replace Brandon Cooks, no issue there. But in terms of consistent fantasy value, I think the wide receivers you want in the Rams are obviously Robert Woods and my little Cooper Kupp, and that's how I have them ranked. I have ranked Woods and Kupp here. We've heard all offseason, and the expectation is, certainly because we saw it towards the end of last year, that the Rams are going to go to more 2 tight end sets. They're going to go to more 12 personnel, that you'll see both Tyler Higbee, who broke out last year as sort of a 3rd wide receiver, if you will. He was, obviously it's a tight end, but Tyler Higbee and Gerald Everett, who had moments last year as well. So I think you'll see both those guys on the field quite a bit this year. My expectation is that Woods and Kupp are the guys you want. You mentioned Robert Woods. So over the last 2 years, Robert Woods is the 13th best wide receiver in fantasy. Okay, points per game. Wide receiver 13. Like, he just gets no love, and that's with a low touchdown total. He's gotten a little unlucky with the touchdowns. He's never going to be a big touchdown guy, but he should get much more in the 5 to 6 range than he should in the 2, which is what he had last year. As for Cooper Kupp, tied for 7th among wide receivers in terms of red zone targets, 8th highest red zone target share, caught over 70% of his targets. That was 7th best among wide receivers. So he's just somebody that I think needs to get going. It was a weird thing. They sort of changed their offensive philosophy in the middle of the season. They were trying to get their offense going because their line was so bad, and because they were trying to get Gurley going. My belief is that he becomes maybe not the top 10 stud he was for the first half of the year, but much closer to that guy than he was over the second half, where it just seemed like he kind of disappeared. Sean McVay is too good, and Cooper Kupp is too good for that offense to struggle too much. So I believe both guys are top 20 guys, and I think Robert Woods continually, criminally is undervalued.
Yeah, he's such a talented player. He's so consistent. I'm sure Tristan would have him ranked high in his wide receiver consistency rankings. We talked about a lot of different stars here, but there's going to be some values with so many players that don't crack the top 20, even though they are really talented. Mike Clay, I'm going to go to you first. Is there a wide receiver that comes to mind who's ranked outside of our consensus top 20 that you're saying to yourself, you know something, going into my drafts, this might be a priority target for me?
Yeah, it's Marvin Jones for sure. I mean, consider this. Last season, Kenny Galilei, Marvin Jones, Danny Amendola played 12 games together in full. The targets those weeks, Marvin Jones, 86, Kenny Galilei, 85, Danny Amendola, 78. So maybe Amendola is one as well here. Look, I know Marvin Jones is 30 now, but he scored 9 touchdowns 2 of the past 3 seasons. He was on pace for 9 in 2018 as well. We know that he can deliver in that category. His fantasy finishes in terms of points per game during those 3 seasons, 14, 27, and 30. You can get him in the middle rounds right now. He is a tremendous value. And on top of Jones, I throw Sterling Shepard from the Giants in there and Preston Williams in Miami. I like both of those guys as well.
Matthew, how about you? I think you've got some other names that come to mind as being undervalued, even if they aren't the number one wide receiver in their respective offenses.
Well, Calvin Ridley has 8 career games with 8 or more targets. And in those games, he's averaging 24 fantasy points per game, 24.2 to be exact. You think about Michael Thomas last year, who was the number 1 wide receiver at 23.4. So when Ridley gets work, he is just an absolute fantasy superstar. And my expectation here is you think about what the Falcons did on offense in the NFL draft, nothing. And what did they do in free agency? They traded, or in the offseason, they traded for Hayden Hurst because Austin Hooper left. But that's literally the only move they made. And I like Russell Gage as a late-round PPR flyer. Mike Clay put that on Twitter, and I thought that was a nice call. But really, it's going to be the Julio and Calvin Ridley show in a good offense that's going to throw a ton because, again, I don't expect their defense to be great. So Calvin Ridley has easy top 15 upside. Michael Gallup, I don't think people realize how close Michael Gallup and Amari Cooper are. Just the fact is he's going 20 spots lower at the wide receiver position than Amari Cooper. So here's a guy that was 6th among wide receiver in yards per game. He was 16th among wide receivers in targets per game. Right? After the Cowboys' Week 8 bye last year, Michael Gallup, not Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup led the Cowboys in target share, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. He averaged 15.3 fantasy points per game. Amari Cooper averages 12.9. Now, I still have Amari Cooper ranked over Michael Gallup, but I think this is 1 and 1A, not a clear-cut 1 and a clear-cut 2, the way a lot of people have. And I just think if I'm a defensive coordinator going like, okay, wait, so I got Amari there and I got Gallup there and, oh boy, there's CeeDee Lamb and I got to be honest with Zeke in the backfield. Like, that offense is going to be really, really good. And we noticed last year because Randall Cobb was actually, a top 30-ish wide receiver in the weeks that him, Gallup, and Cooper all played. That Cowboys offense can support 3 fantasy-relevant wide receivers. So I think Michael Gallup is another name that could easily take that leap this year to being, a top 15-ish guy.
Okay, so let's move along here to wide receivers that have new quarterbacks. Eric, you mentioned earlier you're not that nervous about specifically Julian Edelman and James White, the Patriots' top 2 pass catchers from last year, now that it's Jarrett Stidham. So I'm going to apply the same question to 2 players in A.J. Green and Tyler Boyd. And by the way, we understand that A.J. Green missed all of last year because of an ankle issue, but it seems right now that he's on track to be ready to go if we do start the regular season on time. New quarterback in Joe Burrow, you're optimistic about him. I'm assuming that means the same thing about these 2 wide receivers.
Well, one of them, you point out A.J. Green missed the season, but he still hasn't played more than 10 games in a season. He's only done it once in 4 years, so he had injury problems well before last year. I think Joe Burrow is throwing for 4,000 yards, and I think Tyler Boyd gets at least a quarter of those. People forget Tyler Boyd was actually better 2 years ago when A.J. Green was on the field. So if you're optimistic there, you have to be optimistic about Boyd. I want to get Tyler Boyd into my top 20 wide receivers. I think if he had 1,000 yards last year in that mess, look what he could do with Joe Burrow, a mature guy, very accurate passer. I think Boyd's going to have even his best year in 2020. I really like him a lot, and I'm not going anywhere near A.J. Green.
Well, that would have worked for you last year, Eric, because am I admitting this right now on Virtual Summit? Yeah, I might have drafted A.J. Green in a league or 2. Didn't quite work out for me. Hopefully A.J. Green is back, but I understand those that will be resistant to drafting him after last season. So DeAndre Hopkins was traded. You may have caught wind of it. I don't know if you guys are big football enthusiasts or not. If you haven't heard of it, he got traded from the Texans to the Cardinals. The Texans eventually traded for Brandon Cooks. They still have Will Fuller, and as of right now, Kenny Stills. There are other pieces on this roster that have some upside and some promise. But, Mike, DeAndre Hopkins is gone. Does that mean that Brandon Cooks is going to become, DeAndre Hopkins light?
Well, I would not go that far. That would be disrespectful to DeAndre Hopkins, and all due respect to Brandon Cooks, who has been a top 15 fantasy wide receiver 4 of the past 5 seasons. So I think he'll play a big role, obviously, in this offense, but they have some other mouths to feed, of course. They're going to try to make David Johnson look good after that ridiculous trade. You have Randall Cobb there in the slot. You have Kenny Stills. And you have Will Fuller, who I actually prefer here, guys. I think he is the clear number 1. And honestly, if durability wasn't a question, we'd be talking about him as a borderline top 10 fantasy receiver. And if that sounds crazy, well, consider this. In 9 full games Last season, he averaged almost 8 targets per game. That was a 25% share, and trailed DeAndre Hopkins by only 9 targets during that span. He was the number 13 fantasy receiver. And again, that was with Hopkins in the mix. So tons of talent. He's a former first-round pick. Maybe this is the year. I mean, how many times have we been tricked into thinking this guy was going to break out and he can't seem to stay healthy? But that's not all on him. Hopefully he can get through 15-plus games this season and finally break out. But if I'm looking for a flex option, it's Fuller number 1 for me, and then Cooks is a few picks later.
Okay, Eric, you disagree with that at all, or do you feel like that's how you should be stacking them in terms of the Texans wide receiver?
I agree with Mike saying, but I mean, I think Will Fuller pulled a hamstring while he was talking. I mean, you got to be real careful with brittle players. I mean, players don't get healthier as they get older. I love Will Fuller as well, and I would draft him and think of him as a guy who, when he's healthy, I would use him, but I can't make him one of my top, I don't even, maybe 3 wide receivers in a standard draft because just can't stay healthy. And these guys don't get healthier as they get older.
Here's a fun fact. Will Fuller might have missed a bunch of games last year, but when I played against him in the War Room League against Stefania, he had over 50 points.
Yeah.
I'm not salty about it, I promise.
No, you've gotten over that well. It's nice.
I've handled it very well. Hey, Matthew, Devante Parker.
The challenge with Will Fuller is, to Eric's point, is the injuries have been soft tissue, right? There haven't been like sort of fluky injuries. It's always been the hamstrings. And I really feel like Will Fuller leads the NFL. It's him or Matt Breida leads the NFL in games started and then left early. So that's always the challenge with Fuller. Like, he's phenomenal. I mean, to Mike's point, him and DeAndre Hopkins, when they were on the field together, averaged 16.5 targets. So, I mean, in games in which he's healthy, he's going to be a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. It's just, can he stay healthy? An awesome flyer to take, but to Eric's point, tough to count on him as one of your starters week in, week out.
If for some reason you made Devante Parker a flyer last year, well, before the season, it meant you either were a huge Dolphins fan or maybe a Louisville fan or maybe in the Parker family because, let's be honest, no one made Devante Parker a flyer last year. They made him a waiver wire ad because he was incredible last season. Incredible. Matthew, are you buying it? Devante Parker last year was so good on a nearly weekly basis. He earned himself a fat new contract extension, 4 years and $40 million. That's the kind of money you make. Is Devante Parker now a lock-it-in fantasy football asset?
That's a bit strong for me, given that, we've got like 4.5 years of him doing nothing and then, much of one season being awesome. Listen, from week 3 on last year, he was the 3rd best wide receiver in fantasy, 5th in total air yards, 9 touchdown receptions. He had 9 entering last year through 4 NFL seasons. So it was a monster year. But I think what gives you encouragement is that the Dolphins are still rebuilding. And whether it's Fitzmagic or Tua, they're going to be throwing it deep. They didn't do a lot in terms of the draft or free agency to add. Like, it's going to be Devante Parker, Preston Williams, and Mike Gesicki. So I think Parker is the number 1 on an offense that's going to be better than people think, especially if Fitzpatrick is the starter for at least the first half of the year while Tua gets healthy. So I am more buying Devante Parker than not, yes.
Okay, that's a good thing. Either one of you saying, hey, you know something? It's great. It was an awesome one-year run, but I would stay the heck away. Mike or Eric, either one of you staying away from Devante?
I'll just say this. They say fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. What if you get fooled 4 or 5 times, at this point? I don't know. I don't know what to say with this guy. It's almost like whatever your gut instinct says, do the opposite, because that's what you kind of get, right? He busts for 4 years, and we were always kind of hyping him up, and then finally we just all give up. I mean, the Dolphins gave up. Adam Gase was ready to move on, and then he breaks out. It's unbelievable, but he's certainly positioned for a big role in that offense. They should score more often, be better. So for me, he's wide receiver 30. I'm going to knock him a little bit from where he was last season, but I still consider him a borderline wide receiver 3 option.
But Mike, can't you make the argument about Devante Parker that I agree with you? Listen, but he was a first-round pick, right? I mean, so it's not like the talent came out of nowhere. This is somebody that was very highly regarded out of Louisville, as Field mentioned. And then one of the reasons why me and you and every other fantasy analyst have at least one, this is the Devante Parker breakout year piece in our analysis over the last 5 years, right? I mean, I really think me, you, and Eric have at least written that at least once, along with pretty much everyone else in the fantasy industry, is because we've seen that talent, because we've seen those flashes. And couldn't you make the argument that for whatever reason he didn't mesh with Adam Gase, and there was always stories off the field, but now here comes Brian Flores, from the Belichick school, whole new regime. And for whatever reason, that worked with Devante Parker. Something clicked in last year that hadn't been there in the previous 4 seasons. And clearly the Dolphins, who have a plan, thought there was more legit than not because they signed him. They could have easily just let him go.
Yeah, many have equated Brian Flores' influence on Devante Parker to my influence on Matthew. Matthew sort of treading water until I arrived as part of the podcast. I joined the show. Matthew finally hits his stride, has not slowed down since. We hope the same for Devante Parker. We've talked about a bunch of guys inside the top 30. So let's start to talk about some players. And by the way, that was an interesting non-response from Matthew, which means he totally agrees with my assessment there.
Oh, sure.
But let's talk about some guys that are not inside the top 30. Mike, who you think have a chance to make a leap this season?
Yeah, I think there's a few guys. I'll quickly run through them here. I'd say Debo Samuels, number 1 on my list. I mean, week 10 on last season, he played 82% of the snaps. He was kind of a part-time player before that, had almost 700 yards and 4 touchdowns from that point. I was a top 10 fantasy receiver. So like his breakout prospects, Marquis Brown, unsustainable touchdown rate last season, guys, but it's his second season. He was a first-round pick last year, and I'm told the Ravens' offense is pretty good. So I think he's positioned for a step forward in terms of usage and production this season, especially if he holds up a little bit better in terms of health. I mentioned Preston Williams earlier. We just talked about Devante Parker. Well, Preston Williams was out-targeting Devante Parker and was wide receiver 37 in fantasy before he tore his ACL. So if he comes back strong, a ton of talent there for the 23-year-old. And we talked briefly about the Patriots, another first-round pick from last year, N'Keal Harry. Yes, Tom Brady's gone, but, I mean, we're talking about the guy here in Harry who actually led the Patriots in targets during their final 2 games, including the playoff game last season after being injured. Most of it was already trending up. Perhaps the opportunity to be their number 1 receiver on the perimeter. So a little bit risky, obviously, but you're not spending much. You can get him for a mid to late round pick, take a flyer on talent. Harry obviously has that.
All right, Eric, how about you? A couple of other names to throw into the ring.
Yeah, and Mike's right about N'Keal Harry. Let's not assume that New England does not know what they're doing. Stidham might be really good. I have 2 guys that I think are going later than they should. I don't know where we rank DK Metcalf of Seattle, but he's almost in my top 20 wide receivers. He had a really nice rookie season, 900 yards, 7 touchdowns, and we saw what he did to Philadelphia's terrible secondary in that wild card game. I think DK Metcalf might be Seattle's best wide receiver in 2020. And another one is Hunter Renfrow of Oakland, of now Las Vegas, who closed really strong last year with 100 yards and a touchdown in each of the final 2 games. This is a slot guy who is always open. And no matter who the Raiders quarterback is, they're going to get him the ball. I think Hunter Renfrow is getting like 75 or 80 catches this season, maybe 5 or 6 touchdowns. This is a guy who's going to be, I think, at times, a wide receiver 3. I really like Hunter Renfrow.
Yeah, a guy who certainly made a mark late last season for the Raiders. They've obviously invested in their receiver group this upcoming year, but we'll see how much the lack of time to actually work together with their new team with the altered NFL offseason impacts the development of some of these players. Matthew, you used this stat during our, I believe, tight end conversation about how the group of Evan Ingram and Golden Tate and Darius Slayton and Sterling Shepard and Saquon Barkley played a grand total of 0 snaps together during Daniel Jones' rookie season. Well, Daniel Jones is on track to be ready for year 2, not that there was any concern. And the rest of those guys are, who there actually were health concerns surrounding, are as well. Which of these wide receivers do you think has a chance to make a mark as a possible wide receiver 2 alongside Daniel Jones?
I think there's 2 guys. The concern, of course, is that they have so many weapons, actually, that they spread it around. But you certainly like Sterling Shepard, who, by the way, was wide receiver 24 last year on a points-per-game basis. So he was almost a top 20 guy, wide receiver 2 last year. His 8.6 targets a game, 13th among wide receivers, had 5 or more catches in 8 of 10 games last year. So Shepard just needs to stay healthy, but we know the talent is there. And Darius Slayton was just a revelation last year. I think you watch that kid and you're like, wow, the Giants really found something. For all the grief that Dave Gettleman gets, he hit a home run with Darius Slayton last year, who had 3 different multi-touchdown games, had 6 different games with 7 or more targets, averaged 17.1 fantasy points per game. So when he was getting looked, he was very, very productive as well. His 14 air yards per target were 14th among wide receivers, so you can throw it down deep with Darius Slayton. Second year in the league, we expect a big leap from most players. So I think Slayton is somebody that takes a big leap. Those are the two guys that I'm most interested on the Giants among wide receivers. I want to, but I will just very quickly, because you didn't ask me the breakout question, completely agree with Eric on DK Metcalf. And I love Debo Samuel. Debo Samuel might have to get a restraining order against me because I have him.
Not creepy.
I think of him so highly. But how about Terry McLaurin, who last year was a revelation? I know, I'm a Redskins homer. But Terry McLaurin can play, guys. Terry McLaurin, like, you think about the Redskins offense last year, which went from very pass-heavy under Jay Gruden to very run-heavy under Bill Callahan. So their offense was a bit of a mess. But now Scott Turner comes in along with the Ron Rivera regime. They want to throw. Panthers last year, second in the NFL in pass attempts. Terry McLaurin is their clear-cut number one. And whether it's Dwayne Haskins or Kyle Allen, he is going to get a massive target share in a better offense than you think. It's not going to be a great offense, but neither was Carolina last year, and DJ Moore was a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. That's what Terry McLaurin's going to do. He's going to be the DJ Moore role in this offense.
All right, so let's move forward to rookies who aren't exactly breakout candidates because they've never played in the NFL before. We'll go around the bend. Mike, Eric, and Matthew, give me your favorite rookie based off of his landing spot and ability.
I'm going to go Henry Ruggs here. I have a wide receiver 42, which may not seem very high, but you have to temper expectations for rookie wide receivers. And that includes, by the way, as an aside here, wide receivers selected in the first half of the first round. I mean, you look back at the 15 picks since 2009, Odell Beckham's the only one that's been finished better than 16th. 5 have finished top 30, but 9 of the 15 have been outside the top 50. So even though they have a ton of pedigree, it's hard for these receivers to produce at a high end right out of the gate. But again, Ruggs is going to be a feature target in a Raiders offense that really needs weapons. They have Darren Waller, sure, as a reliable option. Eric mentions Hunter Renfrow, but Henry Ruggs should be their top guy on the perimeter, their playmaker. They're going to manufacture touches for this guy. So of the group, I think he is your best play.
All right, so Eric, your turn now. You kind of teased it earlier, a Vikings wide receiver.
Yeah, it's definitely Justin Jefferson for me. And the reason why Philadelphia did not take him is because they have slot guys and Minnesota needed one. That's why he fell into the Vikings' arms there with that pick in the draft. I think Justin Jefferson comes right in and is an immediate contributor. I mean, obviously, Jerry Jeudy has amazing talent as well, but Denver has a quarterback we don't know about quite yet, and they have other options on the outside. But to me, Jefferson in a PPR, that's the difference in PPR and a non-PPR. Jerry Jeudy is going to have a lot of yards, but I think Justin Jefferson is going to get the most catches there, and that'll be more valuable.
Matthew, we've seen a lot of second-round wide receivers in like real drafts end up being really good for fantasy as rookies. But who was your favorite rookie for this year? Is it someone that was also drafted in the first round?
Yeah, it's interesting. So my highest rated wide receiver is similar to Mike's. It's Henry Ruggs. So
I would say that's similar, yeah.
Yeah. So look, I agree with him. It's just that the Raiders offense I think they're going to be throwing more than Minnesota. My concern with Justin Jefferson, and he's right there as well. But by the way, I mean, I have Henry Ruggs at 49, wide receiver 49. Yeah, so, none of these guys are anyone more than a late round flyer for me. But I do think Ruggs is just a special talent on an offense that's going to try to get creative with him. I don't think he has a lot of competition around him. Hunter Renfrow is a nice little player, and Tyrod Williams, fine. But this offense is going to feature Henry Ruggs, trying to get him in space, yards after the catch, take advantage of that crazy speed. And so, to me, I think Ruggs has the most upside potential. We'll see what happens with Jefferson as well. My concern is, Field, and you mentioned this, we just didn't see Diggs have huge games with Thielen. Like, just how many fantasy-relevant wide receivers can that Vikings run-first offense support?
It's a good question there. And at the risk of being a broken record, I have mentioned the depth of wide receivers so many times. But it bears repeating one more time. There are a lot of really good wide receivers this year, and some of them might be players that we believe in, but we don't even have ranked inside our top 20, top 30, maybe even our top 40. Deep league sleepers. I think Eric may have already revealed his earlier on with a certain Raiders wide receiver, but I'll give him a chance to reiterate that or choose somebody else before going to Mike and Matthew for their deep sleepers.
Yeah, it's Hunter Renfrow for me. I mean, Matthew kind of didn't like his talent as much as I do, but I think he's going to be open a lot and get a lot of receptions. And in the PPR, I want a lot of receptions. And one other guy here that I like later that people aren't mentioning is Rashad Perriman, now in the Jets. He's going to be their top wide receiver. And I think part of the reason Sam Darnold couldn't break out last year, other than, health, was the fact he didn't have a deep threat. We saw Perriman get open a lot deep in the final 3 games. Obviously, his quarterback couldn't have carried less if it was picked off. But now I think Darnold has a legitimate option there. And to me, Rashad Perriman is going to be a guy we play at times, and nobody's thinking about him.
Mike, how about you? Matthew has talked about how the Falcons did really not much on offense this offseason, which could mean good things for somebody.
Yeah, I thought they would address wide receiver and look to try to add some competition for Russell Gage here as a replacement for Mohamed Sanu. They didn't do that, guys. So you look at a guy they took in the 6th round here in Gage back in 2018, and look what he did last season in this pass-heavy Falcons offense after that Sanu trade. Well, if you only count the weeks, I'm not going to cheat here and use the weeks where Julio Jones or Calvin Ridley were out. If we only look at the weeks where all 3 of these guys played, Gage handled a 16% target share. That was just behind Calvin Ridley and was wide receiver 40 in fantasy. So, yes, we are going deep here, but if you're in a deeper, maybe a 12-plus team PPR league, you're looking for a flyer late, a guy that could be a reliable, maybe flex option, maybe Gage is that guy and enjoys a 3rd-year breakout. So that's my deep sleeper.
Matthew, the final word on wide receivers comes from you. Is there a deep sleeper that you think has a chance to make his mark in 2020?
I'll give you 2 here. How about Allen Lazard in Green Bay? You know, we made so much about how the Packers didn't draft anyone. They didn't get any wide receivers. Well, somebody's got to catch the ball in Green Bay beyond Devante Adams. And I'm saying it's going to be Allen Lazard. We'll see if they get anything out of Devin Funchess. But Allen Lazard, who came on towards the end of last year, who Aaron Rodgers had to argue to get into the lineup. They are very close. They spent Thanksgiving together last year, and they've spent a lot of time in the offseason together reportedly. So, yeah, give me some Allen Lazard. The other thing that I think is interesting is my expectation here is that the Bears offense is going to be better under Nick Foles than it is with Mitch Trubisky. And the Bears also didn't do much in terms of their offensive pass catchers or wide receivers, I should say. So Anthony Miller is a guy that I think they're going to commit to. He's a guy who had a really nice rookie year, inconsistent last year, but I like Anthony Miller as a deep sleeper this season.
Like that name as well. The Bears have a ton of tight ends, but their wide receiver group could end up being the difference between them being like they were in 2018 versus 2019 with Nick Foles as the quarterback. Great conversations here surrounding a ton of wide receivers. Again, for the last time, the deepest position we have in fantasy football this year. It starts with Michael Thomas, and then it gets very interesting from there on out. Continue to keep up with all of our virtual Fantasy Summit coverage. For Mike Clay and Eric Karabell and Matthew Berry, I'm Field Yates.
Thank you for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.